let's jump right into this explainer. If you really want to understand how modern consumer targeting works, you've got to look at the psychology behind it. Every product you buy, every single ad that catches your eye, and every aisle you walk down has been carefully engineered based on some pretty deep psychological mapping. Today, we're unpacking the exact roadmap marketers use to decode the mind of the buyer. We're looking at a carefully constructed module drawn directly from our source material that explains the fundamental, hardwired differences in how different demographics think, process information, and ultimately open their wallets. This isn't just about looking at demographics on a spreadsheet, it's about understanding the actual cognitive machinery that drives a purchase. We're going to explore the architecture of this psychological analysis and see exactly how it leads to a highly targeted and incredibly lucrative conclusion. Take a look at the slightly mysterious title of our conceptual roadmap here, Getting to Know the Locals. Let's just let that phrase sink in for a second. In the context of consumer psychology, who exactly are the locals? Well, this phrasing suggests an almost anthropological approach to marketing and consumer behavior. It implies that to truly understand a consumer base, marketers can't just sit in a corporate boardroom staring at data. No way. They have to step right into the consumer's territory, observe their natural habitats, and learn their distinct behaviors from the ground up, kind of like a researcher would when visiting an undiscovered region. It means paying attention to the granular local habits, like how long does a shopper linger in a specific aisle? Do they actually read the fine print on a label? How do they weigh immediate price against long-term value? It's really about viewing the consumer not just as a target, but as a complex culture to be studied and understood. And this brings us to a totally crucial point in the source material. This analysis isn't unpacked as some standard, dry, academic lecture. Instead, it's presented as an exploratory tour of genders. It's deliberately designed as a journey. When you take a tour, you're actively observing, you're comparing things, and you're noticing the unique landmarks of different environments. Here, the landscape isn't a geographical location like a city or a national park. It's the incredibly diverse psychological terrain of different genders. The module guides us through these varying terrains step by step. Just imagine walking through the valleys of emotional resonance and brand loyalty, and then crossing right over into the peaks of logical feature comparisons and rapid decision-making. By framing this as an active tour, the material sets the stage for a much deeper comparative analytical breakdown, making sure we don't just memorize facts, but actually experience the contrast in these cognitive landscapes. So here is where we dive into the deep psychological hook of that tour. The source material explicitly explores the concept of men's and women's brains operating as distinctly different engines when it comes to consumer behavior. It validates a clear psychological bifurcation, but how exactly are they distinct? Well, the analysis suggests that the male consumer brain often leans towards a systemizing approach. It's highly task-oriented, focusing on utilities, specific features, and quick, efficient problem solving. Think of it as the hunter mindset. Get in, find the specific item that checks the box, and get out. On the flip side, the female consumer brain is frequently mapped as highly empathic and holistic. It evaluates a purchase based on a massive web of interconnected factors, things like long-term value, aesthetic appeal, brand ethos, and how the product impacts relationships or household dynamics. It's the gatherer mindset, characterized by comprehensive comparative shopping and detail-oriented evaluation. By clearly defining these distinct cognitive profiles side by side, we establish a definitive foundation for understanding how vastly different psychological approaches require entirely different marketing languages. Okay, so we've mapped out these vastly different psychological terrains, contrasting the task-oriented approach with the holistic evaluation approach. But a tour without a destination is just wandering around, right? So we really have to ask ourselves, where is all this behavioral data actually taking us? How does this conceptual journey bridge the gap from fascinating psychological theory into concrete, practical application? The text makes it abundantly clear that this exploration of distinct brains isn't just for academic curiosity or interesting cocktail party trivia. It is intentionally and methodically building toward a very specific, highly targeted commercial objective. All this mapping of cognitive differences is actually the ultimate setup for a massive strategic pivot. That journey culminates in a very deliberate two-step sequence. First, we take the tour of the genders and deeply acknowledge those distinct cognitive approaches we just talked about. Then, the strategy pivots entirely to its ultimate goal, a singular focus on the argument for the female consumer. All that groundwork, getting to know the locals, touring the distinct cognitive landscapes, it all serves this one targeted strategy. But why this specific focus? The source material leans on a powerful economic reality. Women historically drive upwards of 70 to 80% of all consumer purchasing decisions. Let that number sink in. They act as the chief purchasing officers of their households, buying not just for themselves but for partners, kids, and even aging parents. The lesson deliberately funnels the broad theoretical concept of gender differences straight down to the specific, practical mechanics of engaging the demographic that holds the absolute vast majority of the buying power. Which brings us to a final provocative thought drawn directly from the text's climax, leaving us eager to discover the full depth of the argument behind focusing specifically on the female consumer. The source establishes that understanding these distinct psychological profiles inevitably points businesses toward prioritizing this specific base. But think about how those distinct traits we just toured, the holistic evaluation, the detail-oriented comparative shopping, the focus on long-term value and relationships, how do those actually translate into unmatched purchasing power in the real world? If a demographic controls the majority of the spending and relies on a highly interconnected, detail-rich decision-making process, how exactly do brands need to revolutionize their messaging to win them over? It's a fascinating cliffhanger that completely changes how we view the invisible architecture of consumer targeting.